Hello viewers, I am Prem Ansh Sinha, Editor-in-Chief of Ramjas Political Review. Welcome to another episode of Ramjas Political Review, and for today's episode, recorded on the 8th of August, we have with us Mr. Shivshankar Menon once again. According to us, and it is a well-known thing that there is no better person in India and probably the world than Mr. Menon to understand India's foreign affairs and national security. And our today's episode is about India's national security 101. And there is also very recent development in Dhaka as well. So we will be trying to understand what it means for India in the later half of this interview. Mr. Menon, let us start with some very foundational questions. What does security mean in the context of India's national security advisor? Is it the security of the state or the people? Whose security is it? Does it also include the non-traditional security challenges like the climate change, poverty, social conflicts, etc.? Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be back for the second time, which is a real compliment. Even though I don't think what you said in the introduction is necessarily all true. But anyway, you've raised a very fundamental question about how do we define our own national security, and why do we have a National Security Council and a National Security Advisor? Because we were the first parliamentary democracy to have one, actually, to set up this. And we set it up when we became a nuclear weapon state, overtly, when we declared ourselves a weapon state after 1998, when we tested our nuclear weapons. And when we saw that the environment around us had changed in very fundamental ways. One of them you mentioned, because by the late 90s, it was clear that we were dealing with the consequences of a technological revolution on our security. I mean, the ICT had come in, cybersecurity had become an issue for the first time. There was a whole new domains of contention, space, cyberspace, outer space, etc. And so we had to deal with that. And we had other, as you said, non-traditional threats, whether it was climate change, that's the most extreme, but even terrorism, which had been a traditional threat, had become global. And globalization had created a whole set of threats to India and challenges. But some of these challenges were both challenges and opportunities. So to your answer, yes, it is because our own definition of security had expanded through the 90s as we responded to changes in the environment around us, in the situation, in technology, in the economy, etc. And we realized that security is seamless. So the National Security Council and the NSA, who heads it and who manages it, that whole structure was created to take a holistic view of security, of national security. And that's really why it was set up, because we thought we can't any longer look at security in silos, in segments, as just as military security or just as energy security and have different people look at it without integrating this. So I think you've raised a very fundamental point. And I think our experience since then shows that it was a good choice. It was a good decision. Because you can't draw very simple lines between either between various kinds of security challenges, but also between challenges and opportunities. And each of them actually represents a different side of the same coin.
Right, sir. So, which brings us to another question. And I would like to pose this question to you again, just for the sake of viewers. Whose security is this? Is it for the state? Is it for the society?
Ultimately, our purpose, all those who work for government and government itself, is the welfare of the Indian people, right? So that includes two parts. That includes, I mean, as in any state, at the broadest level of generalization, it includes making your people secure, but it also includes making them prosperous, giving them the opportunity to realize their full potential in their lives. And that, to my mind, is the definition of welfare, of what we, when we seek our people's welfare. But it includes both aspects, and these are inseparable. You cannot have prosperity without security, or security without some means to do it, which requires prosperity and some capabilities, which you develop and grow. So these are linked, actually. So the purpose is the people of India and their welfare, and to ensure that. And you do it by two ways. You do it by ensuring that threats are dealt with, at least in a satisfactory manner, but you also do it by trying to shape the environment in which you are so that it's an enabling environment for India's own transformation and growth and development. So you do also, so it's not just reactive, negative, defensive, it's also proactive. It's also trying to create the environment. And as you get more powerful, you have more ability to do that.
Right.
And we are at that stage, at the cusp, where we are actually moving towards having many more means today than we had, say, in the 50s, 60s, 70s. But we're also dealing with a much more complicated situation.
Right. So, which I would like to move on to another question that complements this particular part. So why do we, it's a very fundamental question, might sound silly, but let me go ahead with this. Why do we have the position of NSA when we already have the foreign secretary to advise the prime minister on external affairs, the CDS to coordinate with the Indian armed forces, the tri-services, intelligence chiefs to work on things that we definitely don't know? How do you distinguish between the various powers, and where does the NSA come in between these ranks?
The NSA's function, NSA traditionally performs, traditionally, I mean, we've only had this in this century, actually, but if you look at it, traditionally what the NSA does in India is three separate functions. One is he manages or coordinates the strategic programs of the government of India, including, whether it's the nuclear weapons program, whether it's other programs like that. Second is he also serves as a direct authoritative channel for the Indian leadership to communicate with other leaderships. The Foreign Secretary represents the government of India, but the NSA is the NSA to the Prime Minister.
Okay.
So there are certain functions where, and so they work together. The NSA and the Foreign Secretary, the External Affairs Minister, they work together. And you will see there's a division of labor between them. But he represents in that sense, and sometimes as a separate diplomatic advisor to the Prime Minister. I mean, that's his function, because he sees things from a different point of view, from a security point of view, not just from a diplomatic or from an economic or from an MEA point of view. And the third function, of course, is the coordination function for the entire range of national security functions, including what you said, coordinating defense and so on. But as I said, he is the only one who takes a holistic view across issues. When you have a problem in Galwan with the Chinese, it's not just a military problem. It is a military problem, but it's a military problem. It's also an economic problem. What are you going to do in your economic relationship with China? It's also a diplomatic problem. How are you going to negotiate your way? Where do you want to get to in your relationship with China? How are you going to explain this to the rest of the world? So it's not just one part. It's also not just an intelligence problem of figuring out, what are the Chinese capabilities and what is their intent and what are they doing? What are they planning? What have they done? It's not just, it is all these things at the same time. And the only place where all that comes together is in the National Security Council, which the NSA manages.
Right. So this was a great comprehensive analysis of the situation, and we were unable to find the precise work of the NSA on the internet, and it and hearing it from you.
Well, I think the place to look is probably Arvind Gupta's book.
Oh, okay. Sure, sir.
On how India manages its national security.
Definitely, sir. So the next question that we have is, do you think internal security problems have external dimensions? What I mean to say is, there is a very popular narrative that was also pointed out in the joint statement by the PRC and Russia that Western powers interfere in the internal dilemmas of countries under the pretext of liberal democracy and human rights. How true is this in the case of India? Do you think our internal challenges are linked with external factors?
Well, firstly, I think there is no purely internal issue or purely external issue. I mean, all these issues are linked, and they are linked by their very nature. It doesn't matter whether it's linked, whether it is a question of economic distress in the neighborhood leading to economic migration into India, or whether it is issues of climate change, which recognize no borders, or ecology. I mean, you name it. There is no country today which is completely autonomous and can run itself. Closest to that is North Korea, and you know how that was. Not very well. So I think that the idea that somehow you can separate your internal affairs from the world is impossible. Even China today is dependent on the world for energy, for food, for technology, for markets, for commodities. China cannot survive without the world. We are all tied to the world in a globalized world. We're part of one globalized economy. So I don't think mentally you can draw this distinction. Secondly, it has never been possible to do this. I mean, China and Russia, when she was the Soviet Union, were busy exporting revolution. What was that? That is part of, that's an attempt to change regimes and make them into what you like, right? Today, China and Russia, the US are doing that. I'm sure this has done it. I mean, I think there was a listing somewhere of regime change attempts by the US since 1950. I think there were something like 72 such attempts, with Moscow in Iran and 53, etc., etc. I mean, the list is very long. So, frankly, this is a question of the pot calling the kettle black. I mean, Marxism wanted to export revolution and permanent revolution. And we had Indian communists who were saying that Chairman Mao is our chairman. You know, what is this? This is interference. But so in practice, when you look at the world as a realist, you have to accept that this has always been going on and will always go on. I mean, even what was Wilson's 14 point. But today, there has never been a time when you can say this is my internal affair and nobody else's affair, unless you go back 1,000 years. Then you can say, yes, in India, we lived in our own little world, the Chinese lived in their own world, and we exchanged, you know, pilgrims, religion, goods, etc. But we didn't affect each other's politics and security because of the state of technology and economy at that time. But today we do. And for the last 500 years, certainly, we have all been affected by the outside world. You've seen what imperialism, colonialism did before, what communism did, what market fundamentalism and this whole neoliberal construct did. So I think as a realist, you might not like it. You might say this is wrong. You might say it's against the charter. You might say, oh, but the norms are being violated. But as a realist, I think you have to accept that this is not a distinction or a line. This is a good propaganda talking point. And each one will say the other fellow is much worse and that he has done all the bad things, omitting the mote in his own eye, never mentioning his own behavior.
So what you're trying to say is that this has always been a case. External countries have been trying to influence the internal issues and probably also amplifying those cases. Is this and this is and the case in the 21st century is no different from the past 500 years? Is this
what I'm saying is that people's capacity to interfere today is much more.
Okay.
because technology makes your borders porous, thanks to the internet, communications, etc., and because you're all part of a globalized economy. So you're dependent on each other in a way that you never were before. But this has grown over the last 500 years. After all, what was colonialism? What was imperialism?
Right.
And you've had, since Vasco da Gama came, you've seen people interfering.
Right, sir. So, sir, let's
This
move
is a
to
long time.
so let's move to
So
the era post-independence.
my point is simple. Post what?
Post-independence of India in 1947. Has there ever been an instance? Do you think
Yeah,
there
I
has?
mean, why did they ask you to join their blocks? And why did you choose to be non-aligned? Because
Right.
you didn't want to be like them.
Okay.
You thought you were unique, you had special problems, which was true, and that you would chart your own path. And you have charted your own path because you are different from the others. But they wanted you to join the socialist bloc or the capitalist bloc, the so-called free world, as they called it. So, I mean, I think, there's a level of unreasonableness when you have to distinguish between reality and norms and aspirations.
Okay.
And I think, especially in political science, there is a level of problem. Now, you can accuse realists of presentism because they seem to think that what there is now is there will go on forever, which doesn't necessarily happen. Things change in politics very fundamentally and very suddenly. But the idea of interference is common across the political spectrum, from the extreme left to the extreme right. They're all interfering.
Okay. So while you mentioned the non-aligned movement, I would like to get a bit diverge from the conversation with respect to the national security and get on to the non-aligned movement, because a particular paragraph from A Life in Diplomacy by Maharaja Krishna Ras Gotra, the former Foreign Secretary of India, struck my mind. So he was quite skeptical about the non-aligned movement, and he wrote that multi-alignments, something sort of a multi-alignment might have been a more appropriate option for India in that era. What do you think of this particular policy that was adopted by India in the 1950s?
I think it was a really brave and actually a good strategic move. Uh, I don't think there was any multi-alignment possibility in a bipolar world with two divided blocks.
Okay.
Then who is the multi that you're going to align with? And we always define non-alignment positively. We said non-alignment means that we will judge every issue in terms of our own enlightened self-interest, and we will pick who we support or don't support or our stance based on our interest. That was what non-alignment was. It wasn't it wasn't neutrality. It wasn't a denial of relations with anybody else. So I think, given the circumstances, I don't think there were any other options except alignment or non-alignment in a bipolar world. And to that extent, I think we succeeded.
So it is often said that popular opinion and national interests both are intertwined when it comes to decisions pertaining to diplomacy and national security. How different do you think India's national security threats would have been had both of them been independent of each other? Let us assume that both of them were independent of each other and the popular opinion did not impact the decision made by the government. How different do you think us challenges would have been?
I don't think that situation can ever arise, at least in a democracy, because the government's survival depends on what people think of it. So you might say that, oh, I'm making these calculations purely on foreign policy grounds and so on. But at the back of every politician's mind will be, what do the people think? Or at least what he or she thinks the popular opinion is. So I don't think you can actually distinguish between the two and say that, oh, you can take foreign, that there are some pure foreign policy decisions that you take without taking popular mind into consideration. What the leader has to do, and this is something that not just the leader, but the system itself has to explain itself in the democracy to the people. And if necessary, create opinion in favor of whatever the proposed course of action is. In most cases, I've seen that while the chattering classes often tie themselves up in knots on issues of importance, foreign policy and security issues of importance, popular mind is normally quite clear. The people are actually much wiser than all the experts and the politicians and the bureaucrats. And I've seen this over and over again, whether it is on the boundary with China, whether it was on the India-US civil nuclear agreement, on whether it was how to deal with Pakistan. Popular opinion is clear and is ready to support initiatives which experts and politicians and bureaucrats get very nervous about and say, no, how can we change? How can we move forward? And I've seen this over and over again. So I'm not sure that there's a contradiction between the two, between foreign policy considerations and popular opinion, at least not in India, in my experience.
So let us say that I think all of us here would agree that let us not make that assumption. So do you think, first of all, so do you think India's policy towards Pakistan is driven by the popular opinion that and the fact that a government can be thrown out of power if it does not follow the popular opinion that is there in the country? Do you think it is driven by that?
I don't know about throwing out of power. That's an extreme case.
Okay.
But certainly at the back of every politician's mind, there will be his idea or her idea of what popular opinion is. And popular opinion on Pakistan in India has changed. I think decades of terrorism, culminating in the Mumbai attacks, I think have changed Indian opinion. I think in the 90s and the early noughts, public opinion in India was willing to go the extra mile to improve relations with Pakistan and to make the effort. But I think the cumulative effect of what Pakistan did in terms of supporting cross-border terrorism and so on, especially Mumbai, I think, has changed popular opinion in India. And there isn't much of a constituency outside some parts of northern India Pakistan is not a big foreign policy concern or interest for most Indians today. And that is the change. Okay. And therefore, you can see the change in the way the government of India also behaves. You can see the difference between what NDA 1 did with Pakistan and what NDA now 2, or this present NDA, is doing.
So let us say let us assume that because we assume we are very sure that the government is driven by the popular opinion when it comes to Pakistan. So do you think what would the situation or the circumstances be if the government decides to go against the popular? Let us say that popular opinion was absent when it came to thinking on deciding any foreign policy or a security policy related to Pakistan. How different would it be from now? Just in case the popular...
It's an interactive process, right? Okay. I don't think you can separate these two. It's an interactive process. Government also creates opinion.
Okay.
Government guides and leads opinion. Opinion leads and guides government.
Okay.
And so it's very difficult to say that, oh, this is what government thinks, but people are not interested, people have no ideas. No, government will come to its opinions based on what it thinks people thinks. Then it will try and explain what it's doing to people. People will also tell government what they think. So this is where the media, journals like yours, all these matter, because they represent opinion and they represent points of view. So I don't think we can actually make that assumption that some isolated ivory tower policy is made on foreign policy.
So in a democracy, we cannot separate popular opinion and foreign policy. Okay.
Because this is an interactive process which will continue. And it's continuously going on. You can see it change over time. You can track the changes. You can see how policy also changes. But in most cases, they move together. I mean, one affects the other. I think when the Chinese attacked, what the Chinese did between 1959 and 62, for instance, fundamentally changed Indians' views of China. When we saw Tibetan refugees, the Dalai Lama coming, escaping, we saw the attack in 62, the military attack, and I think it did fundamentally change, and that has guided government policy since.
So there has been a lot of debates. There have been a lot of debates surrounding the Agnipath scheme, and within this, a particular instance stems out of these debates that just the majority of the defense budget, is spent on the pensions of the military personnel, the retired and the serving, and I think a very very small percentage is spent on modernization of defense equipments. What do you think? What is your view on this? How do you think of it to be?
Well, I'm not sure that all the consequences of the Agnipath scheme were thought through when it was implemented.
Okay.
And I presume that now that they have experience of it, they would be in a position to actually improve it, to reform it, to change the bits that don't work very well. For instance, for predominantly technical services like the Navy and the Air Force, having somebody for just 4 years is just not feasible, because you can't train them up to the required level, and then you can't lose them every 4 years. You can't start afresh. You can't afford to. You need to have people staying longer. So something closer to the old color service, 7 years extendable, would make more sense. Whereas to try and devise military schemes, especially recruitment, manning, and training, on the basis of how much money you have, is, what I think Winston Churchill used to say about Austen Chamberlain. He looks at the world through the wrong end of a sewage pipe.
Okay.
Because that is actually the tail wagging the dog. Now, can we improve the teeth-to-tail ratio in the budget? Can we improve the ratio of spending on capital expenditure, on modernization, as compared to what we spend on pensions and salaries? Certainly, and we have to find ways of doing it. And maybe, I'm sure the army and the government are thinking of ways of doing it. It has also had a very bad effect on our relationships in Nepal.
Right.
Where over 2 million people depend on the Indian Army for their pensions, and they have their families. At least 6 million more people are actually dependent on this. And it was a form of employment. You now see Nepalese actually being tempted to go and fight in Ukraine by the Russians and in other places as mercenaries. There's even talk of Nepalese being recruited by the Chinese PLA. And whether it's true or not, I don't know. But
right.
So I think we need to enhance our reputation for being reliable and sort this out and improve the scheme. I mean, we've tried it, we've seen how it works, and there's nothing wrong with then learning from your experience and improving. In fact, it's a sensible way to move forward.
And so, how do you think we should go about cutting the expenditure of that is spent on the pensions and the salary of the military personnel? Because
we are not the only country with this problem.
Okay.
And there are obviously other ways, and there are a whole host of proposals made by former bureaucrats, by former generals, on how to do it. Takshashila Institution had done some papers. Various people have done suggestions. I think it's up to government to actually pick and choose which ones work best for us in our situation. This is not rocket science, and we are not the only ones who feel a lack of money and see an increasing salary and pension bill. Part of the problem is manpower levels. We're one of the largest armies or military establishments on earth. The Chinese had cut their army down from 4 million down to 1 million for PLA after Mao's death in Deng's time. I mean, they took time. They took about 8 years to do it. And that's one reason why they have money to spend on equipment.
So
but there are ways of dealing with
Right, sir.
There are ways of dealing with this, which, and this is a new time. We don't need a huge overmanned army. You need a highly trained, skillful army today.
Okay.
And that's really where we need to go. And I think people are aware of this. We've had transformation studies. One of the best was done by V.K. Singh when he was, before he was chief, actually. But there have been more recent, a whole series of studies, Shekhawat, various people saying what kind of army you need and how you need to build an army that is fit for purpose in today's world. And I think many of the solutions will come out of that.
Yeah, that's a fair assessment. Sir, this question I would like to ask you, while you were a diplomat, while you were also the National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India, how do you keep aside your personal views that conflict with that of the government? Because there will be situations where your personal views and experiences might not gel well with the government's. So how do you keep your views in front of them while making sure that you are not burdened, you don't feel burdened or anything as such? How do you go about such scenarios?
My generation was very fortunate. In my experience, I have never worked for a government in India which didn't want to hear the truth or didn't encourage you to express your opinion.
Okay.
In fact, they welcomed it. Even if your opinion differed from your political leader's opinion and so on, all the governments that I have worked for, at least, were more than happy to hear contrary views, different advice, and to hear the truth about what's going on outside in the world and around us, and the likely consequences of what they were contemplating at any time. But ultimately, the responsibility for what government decides is with the politicians.
Right.
And that's an awesome responsibility. And it's not the bureaucrats.
Right.
And so the way I see it, and this was a lesson that I think we learned very early, that you tell the truth, you give the best advice you can, but there is a system, and there are other people who know more than you. There are other people who see different aspects of the same problem. But ultimately, for the political leadership to make that call.
So,
and besides, it's not personal. It's not about you or as a person. It's about work, and it's about getting the best result out of it rather than. So, I think that's really, and I think the mistake is when people start thinking they are their job and make it personal.
Right, sir. Now I would like to open the question. If any of you would like to ask any question to Shivshankar sir, please feel free to ask. We have with us Disha Garg, Naman, Raj, and Arshita Chopra. They are junior editors at Ramjas Political Review, sir.
Mm-hmm.
Naman, Disha, and Arshita, would you like to ask any question? Right. So with this, we come to an end of this interview. Thank you so much, Shivshankar sir, for joining us. It was a delight
Thank you.
with you.
Thank you. This was a real pleasure again.